Melbourne is a very interesting area. It's incredibly diverse. It has a very, very large range of cultures. And when I really sort of sat down to try and think about what that looked like, it was interesting from a number of different ways. Coming in toward the centre, you have quite a strong multicultural European base. And these are the people who came out after the war, around the time of the war, and during the 50s. There was actually a couple of waves of people. So you've got Greeks, you've got Ukrainians, you've got Croatians, you've got Italians. As you go further out, you still have some of those waves of the European groups, but when you look at the range of migration, it's quite interesting because when you think of a map of the world, it's moved east. So it started off through Europe and Eastern Europe, and there's also a strong group of people who speak Arabic, so from the Middle East. There's also a lot of people who speak the Indian languages, so you've got people from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, and then it goes further east, so you've got strong groups from China, the Philippines, and there's probably other countries I've forgotten. But you have an incredible diversity of languages. The services in this area reflect that same sort of diversity. So you have quite a lot of culturally specific service. You have quite a lot of quite small services. And those that are large have services here, but a lot of them are mainly based in the southeast. So it's quite interesting from that point of view. When I put the regional reference group together, the group reflects that multicultural and diverse background. So we have people from a range of different cultures. We have large, medium and small. But as I said, the large providers, even though they're representing the large providers, have some services there, but have a lot of services in the southeast. So that changes also the way they think about what they're doing. For the area, one of the things that was very valuable was to be able to do the Reform Ready review, because as small providers, they're really needing to think about what they need to be to stay viable. And they have the interesting extra thought process that for those providers who are particular European culture, whether they still should be, will be the same space in the next 10 to 15 years. To give you an example, there's one organisation who, prior to the win, but was one particular culture who'd already started to think about it, because that ageing population is going to peak within the next 10 years of the European cultures, but then start to decrease. And so this particular group was ethnic specific in one culture, and they've now become more multicultural. So there's some interesting challenges for them. When we get further out to the outer east, this whole area has been designated as a growth corridor, so you've got a lot of people coming in. But the interesting thing with that is a lot of young people. So as far as aged care goes, we have a wonderful workforce potential, but there's not so many people who are actually aging. Some of these areas out here, the aged population in the next 10 to 15 years is going to increase by 150%. But the numbers are that maybe they're going to increase from 20 to 100 as opposed to 200 to 1,000. So it's a big percentage increase, but not necessarily a large numerical increase. But there still is aged care services that need to happen. And a lot of the local councils are really thinking about what they need to provide as aged care services. Going back to the project though, when we tried to think about a regional thing, workforce was obviously very important, but when you try to think of a single strategy that will suit a huge range of cultures, it's very difficult. If you're a Greek organisation, you're not going to be able to work with me if I'm a Vietnamese organisation, and if you're a Ukrainian organisation, it becomes very difficult to have a single strategy that can be done together. But when we started to think about it a bit further, we started to think about the direct care workers. A lot of them are community-based organisations, and we really felt with the aged care reforms and all the changes, they're right at the forefront of all of these changes. there are a lot of resources and a lot of things that are being developed, but they're often at organisational level or at case manager level or management level. So they wanted to think about a way to be actually able to support the direct care workers, and that's where we got to. So we've had a lot of iterations along the way as to what that would look like, and we're still thinking about it. We've come to the conclusion of developing a resource for direct care workers as a starting point, and there was a lot of information put in as far as what are the important things in there. So then we started to look into it a bit further, and we've discovered AXA has a resource. So we've been able to use that as something where we won't reinvent the wheel, but we'll use that to do something else. So we want to be able to use that as a key resource, but we want to focus more on consumer-directed care. So we've started to really look into the consumer-directed care side of it, and there'll be two parts to it. One is that I'll be looking out to see what else is being developed in that space, and if someone else has developed it, I won't need to do it, but I'll promote it. But if they haven't, we may be able to use what's been out there as part of the promotion and develop something specifically. So it's still very much around supporting the direct care workers. So that's where we're at.
So is that the region? Sorry, I missed.
Yes, so that's the region. So it's it comes in quite close. It's not the city of Melbourne as such, but it starts at Moonee Valley, so it's still quite close. And then it goes all the way out to Hume and Whittlesea. And once you get out to Whittlesea, I can remember waiting for an appointment there and sort of parked by the side of the road and watching the sheep go past on the other side of the road. So some areas, once you get out, are quite rural, but there's a lot of it which is quite Melbourne Central.
There will be some challenging sort of income issues in those areas as well. There'll be poorer communities and ethnic also,
Yes. Some of the socioeconomic the CFA index is quite low in some of those areas. I've had some discussions with the people out in Hume, the city of Hume, who are doing a lot of work, but they're less focused on aged care at the moment. But they certainly have a huge number of people in the 30s and 40s that are looking for work, and that whole area has had a downturn in manufacturing, which has been a large proportion. And even prior to Ford. So they're certainly doing a lot of work around workforce, but at the moment it's aged care hasn't been high on the agenda. I've been out there a few times, so I'm raising the awareness of it, but their demographic is not just there yet. But we wanted to make sure that they certainly didn't forget.
I've noticed there's been a couple of projects in South Australia to get people made redundant from Holden into aged care, and I've seen a couple of stories around about that. And people have, really loved going from, interacting with machines and such, and to actually working with people and actually realising that, after 30 years in the Holden factory, all of a sudden they're really enjoying their work because they feel like they're bringing a benefit to someone. So it's quite an interesting pathway, I think.
And I think the fact that we are developing or resourcing a resource for direct care workers, the RTOs are quite interested in that, because I think they believe they can use this as something to show to their new or wannabe direct care workers as a way of giving them a taste of what is important, but what the work looks like. And I think that's where something like that could be very valuable for someone who's come from a totally different sector. Because if you haven't been in the sector and someone says, why don't you be a direct care worker, it's like saying, why don't you go and live on Mars, because there's nothing to sort of compare it with or to think about.
But there's all sorts of jobs in nursing homes, isn't there? I mean, there's catering and gardening, maintenance. There's all sorts of ways that you can all the ancillary services. So it's a great pathway, as there is a manufacturing downturn and there is going to be huge growth in the need for workers in aged care. I mean, it is an ideal place to tap.
The only problem is that sometimes the areas don't match as far as physically. I know when I went and spoke to the people out in Hume, where they have a whole lot of potential workers, they've done a whole lot of work, and workers generally don't or can't travel too far to their work. And so Hume, as an example, has a lot of workers, but doesn't quite have the same need for aged care services and aged care. Exactly. But there are gradually more aged care services going out there. There's some new large residential services being built, and there's been a lot of discussions around the community care side of it. The interesting thing that will be happening in this area, and that we've been doing some work with too, is that in Victoria generally, the HISC services have been managed by the state. So there's been a whole lot of state discussions about this. By, I think it's the middle of next year, that all moves to the Commonwealth, and as part of that, the services will have to change. So there's work currently being done, and some of the discussions being done between different home care providers as far as thinking about what that might look like and who might benefit and how they might take advantage of it.